Episode 1. Welcome to Aether House. The invitation. The letter had arrived on a cold, dreary morning. Its thick, cream-colored paper was sealed with wax, and the black ink on the page was elegant, almost ancient in its flourish. The writing was unmistakably formal, yet there was something chilling about it. The letter had arrived, addressed to each of them. Strangers who had never met before, but who now shared an invitation to a place that would change their lives forever. You are invited to spend 1 week at Aether House, the letter began, an estate nestled in the hills of Ravenwood, where history and mystery collide. The past awaits you. Will you answer the call? None of them knew why they had been chosen. None of them had heard of Aether House until that very moment, but the curiosity and the promises it held had been too strong to resist. The arrival. Lena stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, looking up at the mansion that towered in front of her. It was huge, more like a castle than a house. Dark. Gothic spires pierced the sky, and ivy crept up the ancient stone walls. The windows were black, reflecting the gray clouds above, giving the house an unnerving, almost lifeless feel. The others had arrived as well. 3 strangers, just like her, each of them drawn to the house by the same mysterious invitation. "I can't believe we're actually here," said a man named Matthew, his voice shaky with nervous excitement. He had dark hair and wore a thick coat that didn't seem to be enough to keep the cold air at bay. He stood beside Lena, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets, his eyes wide as he gazed up at the mansion. "It's stunning," Lena replied, her voice quieter than she expected. She didn't know why she felt so uneasy standing here. But there was something unsettling about the house. Its very presence felt oppressive, as though the mansion itself were alive and watching them. Beside them stood Avery, a woman with pale skin and bright red lips. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a certain detachment in her eyes, as if she didn't care about the house at all. She was more focused on the invitation they had all received, still clutched tightly in her hand. A gloomy fog settled over them as they approached the door, which creaked open before they could even knock. Standing in the doorway was a woman dressed in a black gown with long, silver-gray hair. Her face was serene but unemotional, her lips curved in a faint smile. "Welcome to Aether House," she said softly, stepping aside to let them enter. "Please, come in. Your rooms are ready." The entrance. The interior of the house was just as eerie as the outside. A grand staircase led up to the second floor, flanked by 2 large portraits that seemed to watch them with piercing eyes. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust, the kind of mustiness that lingered in homes untouched by time. The woman, who introduced herself as Ivy, led them through a wide hallway, its walls adorned with old tapestries and antiques. The dim lighting cast long shadows, making the house feel suffocating, like it was closing in on them. "Dinner will be served at 6 o'clock, Ivy said, her voice oddly soft and melodic. "In the meantime, I encourage you to explore. The house is your home for the next week." Lena, Matthew, and Avery exchanged looks. There was an unspoken agreement that they would stay together. The house felt too large, too foreboding to explore alone. As they walked further, Lena felt her heart rate begin to increase. There was something unsettling about the house, as though it had been waiting for them to arrive. They passed what seemed to be a library, a vast room with towering bookshelves, some of which looked as though they had been untouched for years. The whisper of pages turning echoed in the back of Lena's mind. She couldn't help but glance inside the room, but when she did, she caught a flash of movement, a figure too quick to be seen clearly. She froze. "Did you see that?" Lena asked, her voice trembling. Avery and Matthew exchanged looks. "See what?" Avery asked, raising an eyebrow. Lena felt foolish, shaking her head. She didn't know what she had seen. It must have been her imagination, or perhaps the darkness of the house playing tricks on her mind. But deep inside, something told her that it wasn't her imagination. Something was there. The first night, the night descended quickly, and as the 3 of them sat down to dinner in the grand dining room, the house seemed to grow colder, its shadows stretching across the walls like long fingers. The food was exquisite, but it didn't feel real. It was too perfect, too arranged. Every course was just as they had imagined it. Delicious, but with an undertone of oddness that made it difficult to enjoy. As the meal continued, a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, causing the candelabers on the table to flicker wildly. The door to the dining room slammed shut, and they all jumped in shock. "What was that?" Matthew asked, his voice shaky. "Probably just the wind," Avery muttered, brushing it off. But Lena didn't think it was the wind. She felt it again. The presence. Something was watching them. The house had been alive the moment they set foot inside, and now it was awakening. The discovery. Later that night, as they retired to their rooms, Lena couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She had barely closed her eyes when a soft knocking echoed through the hallway. She opened the door to find Matthew, his face pale. "I need to show you something," he whispered urgently. He motioned for her to follow. They slipped down the corridor, past the library, and into a small hidden door at the end of the hall. It creaked as they opened it, revealing a small study filled with books, papers, and objects that looked far too old. Lena's breath caught in her throat. There, on the desk, was a small journal, the leather cover worn and cracked. It looked old, but not old enough to belong to the house. She reached for it, and as her fingers brushed the cover, the temperature dropped. A low voice echoed in her ear, barely audible, like a whisper from the very walls of the house. "You are not supposed to be here." Lena froze. Episode 2, The Whispering Walls. Unease in the air. The night was heavy with an unnatural stillness. The usual sounds of the outside world, distant birds, the rustling of leaves, had disappeared, replaced by a dense silence that clung to the house like a thick fog. Lena lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that the walls themselves were watching her. Every creak of the old house, every subtle shift in the air made her heart race. The bed felt too large, the room too cold. She pulled the heavy blankets tightly around her, but the chill lingered, seeping deep into her bones. She turned her head to look at the clock on the bedside table. It was 2:34 a.m. For some reason, the time felt important, haunting even, but there was no time to dwell on it. Her eyelids fluttered as exhaustion crept over her. Just before she slipped into a restless sleep, the sound of a soft whisper made her eyes snap open. "Lena." The voice was faint, barely audible but unmistakable. It came from the walls, the place where there had been nothing but solid plaster. She sat up abruptly, her heartbeat quickening as she strained to listen, but all was silent. She turned her head toward the wall, the shadows within it deepening like the dark eyes of a predator. A cold shiver ran down her spine, and the whispering returned, closer now, as if it was no longer just in the walls, but in the room itself. "Lena, come to us." The first clue. Lena could no longer ignore the whispers. They had come during the night, while the others slept, and now they were urging her to follow them. She tried to dismiss the sounds, to tell herself it was just her imagination running wild in this haunted place. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being pulled into something far more sinister. The following morning, Lena told Matthew and Avery about the strange whispers. Neither of them seemed to be as affected, brushing it off with a laugh. "It's probably just the wind," Matthew said, as he sipped his coffee. He had always been the skeptical type. Avery, who had been strangely quiet all morning, looked up from her cup with a strange glint in her eye. "Maybe it's something else." Lena raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Avery's lips curved into a slight smile. "I mean, maybe we're not supposed to hear the stories in this house. Maybe we're meant to feel them instead." Lena didn't like the sound of that. There was something in Avery's tone that made her skin crawl, something uncertain, as though Avery knew more than she was letting on. But before Lena could ask more, a loud knock at the door interrupted their conversation. "Come in," Lena called. The door creaked open, and Ivy entered, her expression as calm and unreadable as ever. She was holding a tray with a single envelope on it, sealed in wax. Lena felt a chill sweep through her as Ivy placed the tray down. "A letter for you, Lena," Ivy said, her voice as soft as a whisper. "From the house." Lena's hand hesitated as she reached for the envelope. She could feel it, a sense of foreboding. As her fingers brushed the wax seal, she heard the whispers again, louder now, urging her to open it. But should she? Her heart raced, and her hand shook as she tore the envelope open. Inside was a single page, the ink scrawled in a sharp, jagged hand. "The walls are waiting." That was all it said. The growing paranoia. That evening, things began to escalate. The whispers were no longer subtle. They were louder, more urgent, like voices calling out to her, beckoning her to follow. As the others sat around the dining table, Lena couldn't shake the sense that the house was changing again. The walls, once cold and unyielding, seemed to be alive, shifting and breathing with every passing moment. The lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows across the room. Lena's gaze flickered toward the windows, but there was nothing outside, just empty, endless darkness. She was beginning to feel that the house was alive, that it had been waiting for them. But waiting for what? She glanced at Matthew, who was too busy engrossed in his own thoughts to notice the unease building in the air. But Avery was watching her, a look of knowing in her eyes, like she had already anticipated everything that was happening. "What's wrong?" Lena asked, trying to sound casual. Avery's lips curled into a smile, but it was not a reassuring one. "I think the house is trying to tell us something, Lena. Something we're not supposed to know." Lena felt a wave of unease settle in her chest. She stood up abruptly, excusing herself from the table, feeling like she was suffocating. The whispers were back, louder now, and they were coming from everywhere. The discovery of the hidden door. Unable to shake the feeling that something was watching her, Lena wandered through the darkened halls of the mansion, determined to find out the truth behind the whispers. As she walked past the library, she felt an unexplainable pull toward the farthest corner of the room, where the bookshelves seemed to have shifted. She had never noticed this part of the room before, but as she moved closer, her breath hitched in surprise. There, tucked away behind a row of old books, was a small door. It was barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. Lena's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. The house had been leading her here, she realized. She wasn't alone in this mansion. It knew her. It had always known. The door creaked open with a loud groan, revealing a narrow, hidden staircase leading down into darkness. The descent. Lena's pulse raced as she descended the staircase, the air growing colder with each step. The whispers were louder now, filling her ears, urging her forward. She couldn't stop. She had to know. She had to find the truth. At the bottom of the stairs, the darkness was absolute. Lena fumbled for the light switch, but there was none. No sound, no breath, just a heavy, oppressive silence of the unknown. The only light came from the faint glow of her phone screen as she stepped into the small room. What she saw took her breath away. The walls of the room were covered in written words, their surfaces carved into the stone. The air was thick with the smell of old ink and mustiness, and Lena realized that she was standing in the heart of the house's history. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the walls. The whispers were now a constant hum in her ears, louder than ever, but something else was there, something that made her heart skip a beat. Her name. Lena. The walls whispered her name. Lena gasped, backing away, but the room seemed to move with her, the walls closing in, and then the door slammed shut behind her. Episode 1. Welcome to Aether House. The invitation. The letter had arrived on a cold, dreary morning. Its thick, cream-colored paper was sealed with wax, and the black ink on the page was elegant, almost ancient in its flourish. The writing was unmistakably formal, yet there was something chilling about it. The letter had arrived, addressed to each of them. Strangers who had never met before, but who now shared an invitation to a place that would change their lives forever. You are invited to spend 1 week at Aether House, the letter began, an estate nestled in the hills of Ravenwood, where history and mystery collide. The past awaits you. Will you answer the call? None of them knew why they had been chosen. None of them had heard of Aether House until that very moment, but the curiosity and the promises it held had been too strong to resist. The arrival. Lena stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, looking up at the mansion that towered in front of her. It was huge, more like a castle than a house. Dark. Gothic spires pierced the sky, and ivy crept up the ancient stone walls. The windows were black, reflecting the gray clouds above, giving the house an unnerving, almost lifeless feel. The others had arrived as well. 3 strangers, just like her, each of them drawn to the house by the same mysterious invitation. "I can't believe we're actually here," said a man named Matthew, his voice shaky with nervous excitement. He had dark hair and wore a thick coat that didn't seem to be enough to keep the cold air at bay. He stood beside Lena, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets, his eyes wide as he gazed up at the mansion. "It's stunning," Lena replied, her voice quieter than she expected. She didn't know why she felt so uneasy standing here. But there was something unsettling about the house. Its very presence felt oppressive, as though the mansion itself were alive and watching them. Beside them stood Avery, a woman with pale skin and bright red lips. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a certain detachment in her eyes, as if she didn't care about the house at all. She was more focused on the invitation they had all received, still clutched tightly in her hand. A gloomy fog settled over them as they approached the door, which creaked open before they could even knock. Standing in the doorway was a woman dressed in a black gown with long, silver-gray hair. Her face was serene but unemotional, her lips curved in a faint smile. "Welcome to Aether House," she said softly, stepping aside to let them enter. "Please, come in. Your rooms are ready." The interior of the house was just as eerie as the outside. A grand staircase led up to the second floor, flanked by 2 large portraits that seemed to watch them with piercing eyes. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust, the kind of mustiness that lingered in homes untouched by time. The woman, who introduced herself as Ivy, led them through a wide hallway, its walls adorned with old tapestries and antiques. The dim lighting cast long shadows, making the house feel suffocating, like it was closing in on them. "Dinner will be served at 6 o'clock, Ivy said, her voice oddly soft and melodic. "In the meantime, I encourage you to explore. The house is your home for the next week." Lena, Matthew, and Avery exchanged looks. There was an unspoken agreement that they would stay together. The house felt too large, too foreboding to explore alone. As they walked further, Lena felt her heart rate begin to increase. There was something unsettling about the house, as though it had been waiting for them to arrive. They passed what seemed to be a library, a vast room with towering bookshelves, some of which looked as though they had been untouched for years. The whisper of pages turning echoed in the back of Lena's mind. She couldn't help but glance inside the room, but when she did, she caught a flash of movement, a figure too quick to be seen clearly. She froze. "Did you see that?" Lena asked, her voice trembling. Avery and Matthew exchanged looks. "See what?" Avery asked, raising an eyebrow. Lena felt foolish, shaking her head. She didn't know what she had seen. It must have been her imagination, or perhaps the darkness of the house playing tricks on her mind. But deep inside, something told her that it wasn't her imagination. Something was there. The first night, the night descended quickly, and as the 3 of them sat down to dinner in the grand dining room, the house seemed to grow colder, its shadows stretching across the walls like long fingers. The food was exquisite, but it didn't feel real. It was too perfect, too arranged. Every course was just as they had imagined it. Delicious, but with an undertone of oddness that made it difficult to enjoy. As the meal continued, a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, causing the candelabras on the table to flicker wildly. The door to the dining room slammed shut, and they all jumped in shock. "What was that?" Matthew asked, his voice shaky. "Probably just the wind," Avery muttered, brushing it off. But Lena didn't think it was the wind. She felt it again. The presence. Something was watching them. The house had been alive the moment they set foot inside, and now it was awakening. The discovery. Later that night, as they retired to their rooms, Lena couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She had barely closed her eyes when a soft knocking echoed through the hallway. She opened the door to find Matthew, his face pale. "I need to show you something," he whispered urgently. He motioned for her to follow. They slipped down the corridor, past the library, and into a small hidden door at the end of the hall. It creaked as they opened it, revealing a small study filled with books, papers, and objects that looked far too old. Lena's breath caught in her throat. There, on the desk, was a small journal, the leather cover worn and cracked. It looked old, but not old enough to belong to the house. She reached for it, and as her fingers brushed the cover, the temperature dropped. A low voice echoed in her ear, barely audible, like a whisper from the very walls of the house. "You are not supposed to be here." Lena froze. Episode 3. The Shifting Rooms. Uneasy realizations. The night had fallen heavy over Aether House, its towering presence looming like a living entity, watching, waiting. The strange whispers had become more persistent over the last few hours, a constant undercurrent of murmurs that filled the air, making the house feel even more alive than before. Every floorboard creaked in protest as Lena walked through the halls, the shadows of the mansion seeming to stretch and shift around her. It was as if the house itself was moving, reshaping its very structure to ensure that no one truly felt safe. The walls were no longer static. They had started to breathe, to pulse, as if responding to the presence of the guests who had dared to step foot into its domain. Lena stopped in front of a door she hadn't noticed before. It was new, an inconspicuous wooden door at the farthest end of the corridor, with shadows pooled in dark corners, as if hidden away from the rest of the house. Her heart raced with unease, but she couldn't ignore the pull to open it. The door to nowhere. Her fingers brushed the cold, rough surface of the door handle, the chill sinking into her skin. With a hesitant breath, she turned it, the creak echoing through the hallway. The door swung open to reveal a dimly lit room, a room that had not been there before. Lena's eyes darted around, confusion settling in. How could this room have appeared so suddenly? She stepped inside, cautiously, and immediately felt the oppressive weight of the space. It was filled with old furniture, dust-covered books, and what looked like an ancient chandelier hanging from the ceiling, dimly lighting the room with a flicker of yellow light. The strangest part of all was the book lying on a table in the center of the room. It was large, its cover made of dark, cracked leather, and the pages, when she dared to open it, were blank. But as soon as Lena touched the first page, something shifted. The air grew colder. The walls groaned as if the very foundations of the house were shifting to accommodate something far beyond the ordinary. The book seemed to pulse with an almost unseen energy, like it was alive, and Lena couldn't tear her eyes away from the pages that began to fill themselves with writing. At first, the ink seemed faint, almost illegible, but then it began to solidify, becoming clear, and the words were more than just words. They were memories, stories long forgotten, creeping into her mind. "Lena," the voice was soft but unmistakable. Lena jerked her hand away from the book, her pulse spiking. The whispers in the house seemed to grow louder, almost as if they were mocking her, echoing off the walls in a language she couldn't understand. The shifting reality. It wasn't just the book that was changing. The room around her was transforming, as though it were being rewritten in real time. The walls shifted, the furniture moved. Where once there was a cracked window, now there was a large mirror, reflecting her own face back at her with eyes that seemed unfamiliar, older, more haunted. Lena stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. She turned, rushing to the door, but it was no longer there. The hallway had disappeared, replaced by blackness. Her chest tightened as she realized what was happening. The house wasn't just a building. It wasn't just haunted by ghosts. It was changing its own reality, constantly shifting in ways that defied logic. She wasn't just a visitor anymore. The house was claiming her, just as it had claimed the others before her. The fractured memories. Desperate to find an escape, Lena searched for any possible exit, but every direction led her deeper into the maze of the house. She reached another door, this one old and rusted, but it opened easily enough. Beyond it lay a narrow, winding staircase that descended into an even darker part of the mansion. The air was thick with dust, and each step creaked under her weight, making the silence even more unnerving. At the bottom of the stairs, Lena found herself in a small chamber, dimly lit by a single flickering candle. The walls were covered in faded portraits, familiar faces she couldn't place, all staring at her with eyes that seemed too real. The smell of decay filled the air as Lena stepped deeper into the room. The floorboards groaned, and she suddenly had the feeling that the walls were closing in. Cold fingers seemed to graze her skin, as if the very air was alive with memories of the past. And then she saw it, the mirror. It was large and ornate, its frame covered in intricate carvings that twisted into unsettling shapes. As Lena moved closer, she saw something moving within a reflection, a figure standing behind her, just out of view. She spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing, no one. Lena turned back to the mirror, staring into the dark glass. Her reflection was there, but something was off. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow with a look of utter terror she hadn't seen before. Her reflection smiled, the unseen presence. The air grew dense as the whispers began again, louder now, more urgent. Lena's body froze as the temperature plummeted, the cold biting at her skin like invisible claws. She could feel the presence of something unseen, watching her from the shadows. It wasn't just the house anymore. Something else was here, something that had been lurking in the dark corners of the mansion, waiting. A voice, a faint whisper, drifted toward her ear. "You can't escape. Not now." Lena spun around, but the room had changed again. The walls were alive, their surfaces writhing as if they were being pulled by an invisible force. She stumbled backward, her mind reeling. The house was no longer just shifting. It was controlling her. Desperation clawed at her chest. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. There was no way out. The mansion was alive. The stories it held, stories of those who had come before her, were now her stories too. She felt her legs give way as she collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, her mind spinning as the shadows closed in. What had she done? The house had begun to write her story, and she was trapped in the pages of it now. The coming storm. Lena's eyes fluttered shut, and when they opened again, she was standing in a familiar place, a room she had never seen before. It was drenched in shadows, the air thick with the scent of old paper and forgotten secrets. There, in the center of the room, was a door, the final door. Lena knew instinctively what it was. It was the gateway to the truth, the door that would unlock the final answer to the mansion's dark history. But she also knew, deep in her gut, that opening it would come at a cost. The whispers seemed to grow louder, the voices urging her to open the door, to face what was inside. "It's time." Lena hesitated, her mind screaming at her to turn away, to run, but the house wouldn't let her. She had come too far. The door would open, and with it, the final truth. With a deep breath, Lena stepped forward. Episode 4, A Guest in the Past. The midnight knock. The night had settled heavily over Aether House, and with it came the silence. The kind of silence that suffocates, that presses against the skin, making every breath feel like a laborious effort. The whispers had gone quiet, but in their place, a sense of foreboding lingered in the air, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Lena couldn't sleep. Her mind refused to rest, not with the discoveries she had made earlier. The shifting rooms, the strange book that seemed to write itself, and the whispers that had followed her every step since she had arrived. She tossed and turned in her bed. The sheets tangled around her as she stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the mansion pressing down on her. Suddenly, a soft knocking echoed to the hall, a slow, deliberate series of taps that sent a shiver down Lena's spine. Her heart skipped a beat, and she sat up in bed, her breath catching in her throat. The knocking came again, louder this time, as though it were meant for her. She froze, staring at the door. It was too late for anyone to be visiting, and the others, Matthew, Avery, were asleep in their rooms. They had to be. The knocking was followed by a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, barely a breath. "Lena!" A familiar face. Lena stood, her legs shaky beneath her, as she slowly approached the door. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop as she reached for the handle. She hesitated, her hand hovering just above the brass doorknob. The last few days had blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Every moment spent in Aether House had felt like a waking dream, distorted and unreal. But the knock, the whisper, it was real. With a deep breath, she opened the door. Standing before her in the dim light of the hallway was a figure she had not expected to see, a man she had not seen in years. His dark hair, now streaked with silver, and his sharp features were unmistakable. "Lena?" The man's voice was a whisper of recognition, as if they were long-lost companions, reunited by fate. It was Thomas, the man from her past, the one she thought had disappeared years ago, the one she had tried to forget. The truth beneath. "Thomas, what are you doing here?" Lena asked, her voice trembling as the door opened wider. She didn't know whether to embrace him or run. "I came for you," Thomas said, his expression serious. "You shouldn't be here. This place, it's more dangerous than you realize." Lena stepped back, a mix of relief and confusion flooding through her. "How did you know I was here?" Thomas took a step forward, his face strained with worry. "I didn't know at first, but I knew the house would call to you. It always calls to those who have unfinished business. I've been following its trail for years." Lena stared at him, unsure whether she could trust him. Thomas had been a part of her life once, but his disappearance had left a void, a mystery she had never been able to solve. You left me without a word, and now you're telling me this place has been calling to me?" Lena's voice cracked with resentment. "I know, Lena. I know," Thomas replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Aether House is not what you think it is. It's not just a house. It's a prison, a place that traps you in your own memories. It feeds on regret, on guilt, on unresolved pain." Lena's heart thudded painfully in her chest. "Then why come here now, after all this time?" Thomas's eyes darkened, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Because it's not just you, Lena. It's all of us. The house is using you, and everyone who's come here. It's rewriting our past, shaping our futures. And soon, there won't be anything left of us but the stories it's written. A house that remembers." Lena was starting to understand, but the truth was harder to swallow than anything she had ever faced. She had come to Aether House looking for answers, but all she had found was more confusion. Now, standing before Thomas, she couldn't tell whether this was another trap, another piece of the house's game. "I have to stop it," she whispered, almost to herself. Thomas shook his head. "It's too late. The house has already started to take your memories. It's only a matter of time before you forget who you are completely, and then you'll become part of the house's history." Lena's hand shook as she reached for the door, suddenly feeling trapped again. "How can I stop it, then? How do I get out of this place?" Thomas's face softened for a moment, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You can't escape it, but you can remember. The house cannot control your memories unless you let it." "Remember?" Lena repeated, the word feeling like a lifeline. "Remember what was taken from you, Lena. The house steals from us, takes what we cherish, and locks it away. But if you can reclaim your memories, you can reclaim yourself. The key to defeating it lies within what you've forgotten." The words were cryptic, but they rang true in a way Lena couldn't explain. The house had stolen something from her. She realized something vital, something she couldn't quite grasp, but it was there, buried deep within her mind. "I don't understand," Lena whispered, her voice breaking. "How do I find it? How do I find what was stolen?" Thomas's gaze grew distant, as though he were looking into a past she could never reach. "There are places in the house, rooms, that hold the truth. The house keeps its secrets locked away in the darkest corners. But if you search, if you can remember what you've lost, you'll find the way." A new threat. Before Lena could ask more, a sound, loud, insistent, and growing, cut through the silence. It was a sound of scraping metal, coming from down the hallway. It echoed like the claws of something scratching at the walls. Lena spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Thomas's eyes widened, a look of dread passing over his face. "The house is waking up," Thomas said urgently, grabbing her wrist. "You have to go, now." But Lena was frozen, staring down the hall, where shadows seemed to move unnaturally. The walls of the mansion had shifted again, closing in as if the house itself was trying to keep them in. Episode 5. The house wants more. The unseen hunger. The silence in Aether House was suffocating, more so now than ever before. Lena's mind had begun to unravel the deeper truths behind the mansion's design. The walls weren't just walls, and the rooms weren't just rooms. This place was alive, breathing in a way she couldn't explain, shifting and changing as if it were consuming the very air around her. Since her conversation with Thomas, Lena's perception of reality had become distorted. She had thought she was simply staying in a haunted house. But now she understood the truth. Aether House wasn't just haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by its own existence. It was a sentient entity, a monstrous force that fed on memories, on the lives of those who wandered within. The house had invited them all here, drawn them like moths to a flame. And now, it was beginning to consume them, piece by piece. Lena paced the dark hallway, trying to steady her breathing. Every room she entered felt wrong, twisted in ways that made her head ache. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, and there were whispers, louder now, more insistent. Lena, her breath caught in her throat. The voice was familiar. It had been following her, taunting her. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper she was hearing. She could feel something, a presence, a dark force closing in, its grasp tightening. Lena stopped in her tracks, her heart thudding against her chest. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The house seemed to respond, a low groan emanating from the walls, as though the mansion itself was alive, breathing in the very air around her. She could feel the weight of its presence growing heavier, pressing down on her, threatening to suffocate her. The price of knowledge. Lena's thoughts turned to the diary she had discovered in the hidden study. Thomas's warning about the house's insatiable hunger. She had thought it was just paranoia, but now she understood. The house wasn't just keeping memories. It was consuming them. It was using the past, rewriting it, and devouring the essence of every guest it took. The house was changing its story, twisting it to fit its dark desires. But why? What was it after? And what would it do to her if it had its way? Lena had to find out. She had to know more. She had to understand what was happening. But as she moved through the mansion's twisting halls, she found that it wasn't just her curiosity that was being tested. It was her very existence. Her memories began to blur, and she found herself questioning what was real. Was she the same Lena who had arrived at Aether House? Or had the house already begun to rewrite her, to erase who she was? The eyes in the dark. Lena was drawn toward the library again, the place where she had first felt a shift in the air, the place where she had felt the house's undeniable pull. The door creaked open with a groan, and as she stepped inside, a cold draft brushed her face, carrying with it the scent of old paper and something faintly metallic. The library was even more ominous than before. The bookshelves, once neat and orderly, now seemed to stretch into an endless abyss, the books twisting and warping in their places. The walls themselves seemed to be alive, their surfaces undulating, as though they were breathing with a life of their own. At the farthest end of the room, a strange glow emanated from a corner where an old, ornate mirror hung, reflecting the distorted image of Lena's face. Her reflection, though, was not quite right. Her eyes were darker, her expression twisted in a way that was unfamiliar to her. She stepped closer, unable to look away. The house was showing her something, but she wasn't sure if it was a truth or something it wanted her to believe. Then she heard it, the whisper, "We are not who we were." Lena's breath caught in her throat. The voice was familiar, but distorted, like a memory slipping just out of reach. It felt like it was calling to her, urging her to look deeper, to understand something she had yet to see. With trembling hands, she reached for the mirror. As soon as her fingers brushed against the glass, the reflection shattered, splintering into pieces and scattering across the floor. In the shards, Lena could see the face of someone else, someone familiar but wrong, a version of herself twisted and broken. The house's hunger. Before she could react, the walls seemed to close in around her. The air grew thicker, and Lena felt a pull at her chest, a magnetic force drawing her deeper into the library's heart. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding, but it was no use. The house was not going to let her go. "You belong to us now, Lena." The voice was low, almost reverberating within the walls, as if the mansion itself was speaking through the whispers. Her skin crawled as she felt the weight of the house's intention pressing down on her. It wasn't just haunting her. It was trying to consume her, to take her memories, to rewrite her existence. Lena could feel her identity slipping away, like sand running through her fingers. She had to fight back. She had to remember who she was before it was too late. But the house had already begun its work. She was no longer certain what was real and what had been rewritten. It was a war between the house's twisting power and her own desperate will to hold onto the memories she had left. The revelation. As the house closed in around her, Lena saw a faint light flickering at the far end of the room. A door, half hidden in the shadows, beckoned her forward. It was a door she hadn't seen before, but she knew instinctively that it led to the heart of the house, to the answers she needed. Lena ran toward it, her legs heavy, but her determination burning brightly. She reached for the door handle, but as she touched it, a sudden scream filled the air, sharp, guttural, full of agony. It wasn't her own voice. Lena spun around to find Matthew standing in the doorway, his face contorted in horror, his eyes wild. He tried to speak, but only a raspy breath escaped his lips. "Lena," he whispered, reaching out to her, but his hand faded as if the air was pulling him back. Before she could respond, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, and the room plunged into darkness. Episode 6. Breaking the Illusion, the Return of the Echoes. The atmosphere in Aether House had shifted once again. The walls, which had once seemed to pulse with life, were now eerily still, as if they were holding their breath, waiting for something. Lena felt it, the oppressive weight of the house pressing down on her chest, its malevolent energy growing stronger by the minute. It had been days since the last encounter with Thomas. Since then, the house had become a prison, a place where time didn't make sense, where rooms shifted, and where memories seemed to fade into oblivion. But what terrified Lena the most was the feeling that she was no longer just a guest. The house was shaping her, rewriting who she was, just like it had done with everyone else who had come before her. She couldn't shake the sense of being watched, as if the house had eyes, following her every move. Every breath felt suffocating, and the shadows in the corners of her mind began to blur with the ones in the house. The whispers had become louder again, calling her name, no, commanding her. Lena knew she couldn't ignore them any longer. She had to face the truth. The house wanted her. It wanted to consume her, to absorb her memories, to make her a part of its twisted, eternal existence. But there was something else, something deeper, something she couldn't explain, but could feel within her very soul. A meeting with the past. Lena had always been one to question everything. She had to. In a place like this, where reality twisted and memory slipped through her fingers, there was no room for doubt. But even her natural skepticism couldn't shield her from the truth. The house had already begun to rewrite her past, and with it her identity. The mysterious journal that Thomas had mentioned, the one filled with half-finished stories and scribbled fragments of history, had been her only clue. Each entry she'd read had unlocked pieces of a larger puzzle, revealing glimpses of those who had entered the house before her. And now, the journal itself was calling to her, as if it were the key to everything. Lena made her way through the darkened halls of Aether House, her steps echoing in the emptiness. The light from the flickering candle she held was barely enough to illuminate the path ahead, but it was enough for her to see the shifting shadows on the walls, their shapes twisted and unfamiliar. She finally arrived at the study, the one room that seemed to remain relatively untouched by the house's manipulation. The door creaked open with an unsettling groan, and she stepped inside. The room smelled of old paper and dust, its shelves filled with ancient books and journals that had not been disturbed in decades. There on the desk was a journal, the one she had come to rely on. As Lena approached the desk, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A new entry had appeared, scrawled in a hand she did not recognize. The ink was fresh, and the words were so clear, it was as if they had been written just moments before. The house will not let you go. It has taken too much from you already. Lena's breath caught in her throat. The words were familiar, and yet they felt wrong, as if the house itself were speaking to her. She ran her fingers over the page, her pulse quickening. It was a final warning, the one Thomas had spoken of. She had been chosen, just as the others had been. And now, the house was ready to claim her as its next victim. The breaking point. A sudden shudder ran through the house, as though it were being shaken by an unseen force. The lights flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls, and the floor beneath Lena's feet seemed to shift once again. The screeching sound of metal filled the air, followed by the sound of something heavy moving within the walls. a deep rumbling that reverberated through her very bones. Lena's heart raced. The walls were alive. They were closing in on her, pushing her toward the edge of some unknown precipice. She could feel it, the growing intensity of the house's hunger. But there was something more. The whispers had turned into voices, each one a fragmented part of conversation that made no sense. "You're almost there. The house knows you now." The voice was clear, but not from anyone she recognized. It came from the walls, from the air itself. Lena backed away from the desk, her mind spinning. The voices grew louder, more insistent. And then, through the chaos of sound and shifting reality, she saw it, the mirror, the one she had passed countless times but never dared to look into. This time, something was different. The reflection. Lena moved toward the mirror, her legs heavy with the weight of the house's presence. As she stepped closer, the glass seemed to pulse, as if the reflection was alive. She saw her own face, but it wasn't the face she knew. The eyes staring back at her were hollow, empty, a reflection of someone who had already been consumed by the house. The reflection smiled, and Lena gasped in horror. It wasn't her smile. It was familiar, yes, but was distorted, warped by something ancient and evil. Suddenly, the whispers erupted into a cacophony, screaming her name, drowning out her thoughts. "Lena, you're part of us now." The voice in the mirror echoed, and Lena felt the shuddering force of the house pressing down on her. It was closing in, wrapping its tendrils around her soul, pulling her into its endless grip. She reached for the mirror, her hand trembling, but before her fingers could touch the glass, the reflection shifted once more. The face in the mirror was no longer hers, but a dark figure, a figure she recognized. It was Thomas. "It's time." The truth revealed. Lena staggered back, her mind reeling. The truth, the horrible truth, had been there all along, hidden within the walls of Aether House. Thomas, the man she thought she had lost, had never really disappeared. He had been part of the house all along, a prisoner of its dark magic, a soul trapped by its insatiable hunger. And now Lena understood. She had been chosen to take his place. The house was not just a physical structure. It was a vessel, a living, breathing entity that fed on memories, on lives, on the very essence of those who entered it. And now, Lena was at the center of it, the final piece in the puzzle, the one who would either break free or become part of the house's twisted legacy. The final choice. Lena stood in front of the mirror, the weight of the house pressing down on her. The whispers were louder now, the voices of those who had been consumed, their souls trapped within the mansion's dark grip. But the house was not invincible. Lena had a choice. She could either submit, allow herself to be consumed and become a part of the house's eternal history, or she could fight, break the cycle, and destroy the evil that had bound them all. Her hand hovered over the mirror's surface, the dark energy of the house swirling around her. She could feel the power, the pull, drawing her in, but there was a spark of defiance in her chest. She wasn't going to give in. With a fierce breath, Lena reached out and touched the mirror. Episode 7, The Heart of the House, a House of Mirrors. Lena's heart raced as she stood in the center of the mirror room, surrounded by the shattered pieces of glass that had once reflected her own face. Now, as she took a tentative step back, she realized that what she had seen was not just a reflection. It was a distorted version of herself, a version warped by the house's power, by its relentless grip on her mind and soul. The whispers had grown louder, more urgent, as though they were demanding her attention. She could hear them, even now, swirling around her like a storm of voices. Some of them were familiar, echoes of the people she had once known, and others were strange, twisted in ways that made her feel like an intruder in her own mind. Lena looked around the room again, this time with more focus. The mirrors, once pristine, now reflected not just her image, but distorted fragments of the world beyond. She saw glimpses of rooms she hadn't entered, people she hadn't met, and faces that seemed to flicker in and out of existence like ghosts. It was as if the mirrors were stitching together pieces of the house's past and present, creating a tapestry that stretched beyond the confines of reality. "You can't escape, Lena." The voice was familiar, but not one she recognized. It wasn't Thomas. It wasn't Avery or Matthew. It was something older, something darker. Lena stumbled back, her breath quickening. The house was speaking to her. She turned sharply, rushing to the door, but as her fingers brushed against the handle, the sound of crackling glass filled the air. She spun around to see the mirror she had passed moments before changing, the glass warping like liquid. It reflected a new image, not of the room she was standing in, but of something far darker, the vision of a lost soul. In the reflection, Lena saw herself again, but this time her eyes were different. They were empty, hollow, as though her soul had been completely drained. Behind her, a figure stood, cloaked in shadow, its face obscured by the darkness, but Lena could feel its presence, its malevolent energy. The figure stepped closer, its hand reaching out as if to pull her into the mirror itself. Lena gasped, stumbling backward. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice shaking. She reached the mirror again, but this time, the glass was cold, almost icy to the touch. She felt it seeping into her very bones, freezing her from the inside out. "You can't fight it, Lena," the voice whispered, closer now. "You belong to the house." The figure stepped forward once more, its form becoming clearer. It wasn't human, or at least not entirely. It was something else, something that inhabited the house, feeding on the memories and souls of those who dared to enter. It had been watching her since the moment she had stepped into Aether House. It had been waiting. Lena felt a sudden surge of panic. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was using her to rewrite its story. Every corner, every room, every mirror was a part of its intricate web, drawing her deeper into its nightmarish grip. The trap tightens. She spun away from the mirror, her breath shallow as she sprinted toward the door. But it was no use. The house had already sealed her in. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air growing thicker, heavier. The once familiar rooms now felt like a maze, shifting, warping. Her surroundings no longer resembled the mansion she had first entered. She had to escape. She had to find a way out. Lena stumbled down the corridor, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The house was no longer just haunting her. It was actively hunting her, using the very space to trap her in a cycle of fear and uncertainty. Every door she tried to open led to another dead end, another maze, another distorted reality. And then she heard it, the sound of footsteps behind her. Not her own. Someone else was here, someone who had been following her since she arrived. "Lena," the voice was soft, almost affectionate, but there was something wrong in the tone. It wasn't Thomas. It wasn't Matthew. It wasn't even Avery. Lena spun around, her pulse racing, but saw nothing. "Lena, you've been chosen." The voice was closer now, almost whispering in her ear. She turned once more, but this time her body froze. Standing in the doorway behind her was a shadowed figure from a mirror, its features still obscured, but its presence undeniable. Lena's mind raced. The house was alive, and it wanted her. It wanted to consume her, to make her part of its twisted, eternal existence. The heart of the house. The figure took a step forward, and Lena felt her breath catch in her throat. She couldn't move. The air around her was thick with an overwhelming presence, like the very essence of the house had seized her, holding her in place. "You have no choice, Lena." The figure spoke again, its voice a low growl now, its power radiating from the very walls of the house. "The house is hungry, and you are the feast." Lena's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The house was suffocating her. It was using her fear, her confusion, to trap her in its grasp. And the more she resisted, the more it tightened its hold. But then, something shifted within her. A flicker of resistance, a tiny spark of defiance. She couldn't let the house win. She couldn't let it take her. Lena stood slowly, her vision blurry, but her resolve growing stronger. She had to fight. She had to break free. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, the air thick with an unholy energy. But Lena knew what she had to do. She wasn't just fighting for her own life. She was fighting for everyone who had been lost to this house, for the memories it had stolen from them. She turned to the shadowed figure, her eyes hardening with determination. "I'm not yours." The figure laughed, a low, hollow sound that echoed through the house. "You belong to Aether House, Lena. There is no escaping it." Lena's heart pounded as she reached into her pocket, pulling out the key she had found earlier, the one that had appeared in her dreams. The key that she now understood was the key to the house's heart. She stepped toward the figure, her hand trembling but resolute, the final choice. As Lena approached the figure, it reached out to her, its hands cold as death itself. She could feel the dark energy of the house wrapping around her, threatening to pull her into its grasp. But she didn't stop. The key, pulsing with light, began to glow brighter and brighter in her hand, casting an ethereal glow around the room. "No!" The figure's voice rose in fury as it lunged toward her, but it was too late. With a cry of defiance, Lena jammed the key into the figure's chest. Episode 8. Beneath the surface, the breaking point. Lena stood at the edge of the grand staircase, her heart pounding in her chest. Aether House had become her prison, its walls closing in tighter with every step she took. The shifting halls, the mirrors that didn't reflect reality, the whispers, it was all starting to drive her mad. But there was something else, something more sinister beneath the surface. Lena could feel in her bones, an unshakable presence that had followed her every move since she set foot in the house. The house wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, a parasite that fed on the memories of those who entered its walls. And now it had its sights set on her. Lena took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't going to succumb to fear. Not now. She had to fight. As she turned to face the dark hallway stretching before her, a cold chill swept through the air. It was the same familiar cold that had crept over her since her first night in the mansion, but this time it was different. The cold felt alive, a tangible force that moved with a mind of its own. The whispering voices began again, low and insistent, echoing in the darkness. They spoke in tongues, their words garbled and incoherent. But Lena could hear one phrase clearly. "You can't leave. Not ever." She clenched her fists, determination flooding through her. She could leave. She had to. But she needed answers. Answers to the questions that had been gnawing at her since her arrival. The key, the one she found in the attic, was the only clue that could unlock the truth. It was the key to the house, the key to its twisted history. And she was getting closer to finding out what the house truly wanted. The hidden room. Lena's footsteps echoed through the narrow hallway as she moved deeper into the mansion. The air grew heavier with each passing moment, the walls seeming to close in tighter around her. It was as if the house was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. The corridor opened up into a vast chamber, its size making Lena feel small, insignificant. The floor was covered in thick, dusty carpets, the once grand furniture now decaying with age. But what caught her attention was the bookcase on the far wall. Its shelves filled with volumes of books that looked ancient, their leather-bound covers cracked and weathered by time. She approached the bookcase, her fingers brushing against the spines of the books. Some of them were written in languages she couldn't understand, their titles etched in gold and faded with age. But one book caught her eye. It was different. Unlike the others, it wasn't buried beneath layers of dust. It seemed to shine in the dim light of the room, its cover reflecting a faint glow. Lena pulled the book from the shelf, her breath catching as she flipped it open. The pages were filled with writing, but it wasn't written by hand. The words appeared to have been printed on the pages, as if someone had used a typewriter to transcribe them. As she scanned the pages, the text seemed to come alive. The words shifted, rearranging themselves in front of her eyes until they formed a single sentence that made her blood run cold. "You have been chosen to carry the house's curse." The past revealed. Lena stumbled back, the book falling from her hands and crashing to the floor. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps as her mind raced. What did it mean? The curse. She had heard the term before, but it had never seemed real, just another part of the house's twisted mythology. But now, staring at the page, it felt like a reality she couldn't escape. She glanced around the room, her eyes landing on the mirror that hung on the opposite wall. Its surface was cracked, the reflection warped and distorted, but it was still familiar. The reflection she saw was no longer just her own. There were other figures behind her, shadows in the glass, their faces twisted in agonized expressions. Lena took a step toward the mirror, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the cold glass. As her fingers made contact, the reflection changed. The shadows became clearer, and she saw their faces. Faces of people she didn't recognize, but who felt familiar all the same. They were lost souls, trapped in the house's eternal grip, their eyes wide with fear and desperation. A voice broke through the silence, soft but unmistakable. "You are the last one, Lena. The last to carry the curse." Lena gasped, spinning around to find the source of the voice. But the room was empty. The house was speaking to her. The words weren't just in her head. They were being whispered through the walls, carried by the house itself. The curse. She had to know more. She had to understand why she was chosen, why she was trapped in this nightmare, and more importantly, how to break free. The shift in reality. Lena took a deep breath and closed her eyes. The room felt different, as if the house were shifting again, rewriting the very fabric of the space around her. When she opened her eyes, the room was no longer the same. The bookcase had disappeared, replaced by a door, one that had not been there before. It was old, its wood warped and weathered by time. The handle was made of brass, tarnished and dull, but it gleamed in the dim light of the room. Lena walked toward it, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the house's presence again, pressing in from all sides, suffocating her with a depressive energy. She reached for the door handle, but before she could turn it, the whispers came again, louder this time, urgent. They wrapped around her, suffocating her thoughts. "You don't belong here, Lena." The voice was familiar now, the same one that had been haunting her dreams, the same voice that had whispered to her in the mirrors. It was pulling her, drawing her into the house's depths, making her feel like she had no choice but to follow. Lena gripped the handle, but before she could open the door, it creaked open on its own. A chill ran down her spine as she stepped into the next room. The final revelation. The room was vast, its walls lined with mirrors. Some were cracked, others shattered, but all of them reflected something different. Distorted versions of Lena, twisted faces, and shadows that didn't belong. It was as though the mirrors were showing her all the versions of herself she had forgotten. Fractured memories, pieces of a life that had been torn apart. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and atop it, an old, worn book. Lena knew what it was before she even touched it. It was the key to the house, the final piece of the puzzle. She reached for it, the weight of it heavy in her hands. As she opened the book, the words inside were clear, not written in ink, but etched into the pages themselves. They were the house's story, the story of those who had entered and never left. The house had been alive long before Lena arrived. It had fed on the memories of the lost souls who had wandered its halls. And now, it was using her to continue its cycle, to feed on her memories, to turn her into yet another ghost in the house. Lena slammed the book shut, her heart racing. She understood now. The house was a prison, a place that kept its victims trapped in a never-ending cycle of death and rebirth. Episode 9, Into the Abyss, A House That Speaks. Lena's pulse raced as she moved deeper into the mansion, the oppressive weight of Aether House pressing in on her. It felt as if the walls were alive, shifting and groaning under the burden of secrets long buried. Each step she took seemed to echo through the vast halls, the sound bouncing off the decaying walls like a warning. The house was not just a structure. It was a sentient entity, and Lena was at the heart of its twisted design. The event of the past few days had shaken her to the core. Thomas, Avery, Matthew, all had fallen under the house's influence, trapped in its dark grip. Now, Lena knew the truth. The house didn't just want to trap its victims. It wanted to rewrite their memories, to erase their identities, and to absorb their very souls into its eternal web. Lena had barely slept, her mind consumed with the revelations that had surfaced. The journal she had found, Thomas's cryptic warnings, the shifting rooms, the mysterious figures in the mirrors. It was all part of something much darker than she had ever imagined. The house was not just haunted. It was alive, feeding on the memories and souls of anyone who entered. But there was more. Something hidden in the heart of the house, a secret so terrible that it had been locked away for centuries. It was this secret that Lena needed to uncover, the key to escaping before the house could claim her too. The chamber beneath the house. The air grew colder as Lena descended further into the bowels of the mansion. The walls seemed to close in around her as she made her way through the narrow, winding corridors. The darkness was almost suffocating, and every now and then she would hear a faint scratching sound, as if something or someone was moving just out of sight. Lena's heart raced, her breath quick and shallow. She had passed through rooms she recognized only to find them empty, their once familiar walls now warped and stretched. The house was playing tricks on her, distorting reality, manipulating time and space to confuse her. It was as though the house was trying to make her doubt her own senses, to push her into madness. At last, she reached a door, one she hadn't seen before. It was old, covered in layers of dust, its edges worn with time. The key she had discovered earlier burned in her pocket. The weight of it more than just physical. It was as though the key was calling to her, urging her forward. Lena hesitated for a moment, the ominous feeling in her chest growing stronger. But she couldn't turn back now. She had to know the truth. With a deep breath, Lena turned the brass handle and pushed the door open. The room before her was vast, its walls lined with bookshelves that seemed to stretch into infinity. The air was thick with the smell of old leather and musty pages, and there was a faint, eerie glow coming from the center of the room. In the center of the room was a stone pedestal, upon which rested a large book. The book was old, its pages yellowed with age. But it wasn't the book that caught her attention. It was the marking on the cover. A strange symbol, one she recognized from her dreams, was etched in the center. It was the same symbol that had appeared on the journal she had found in the attic, the one Thomas had warned her about. Lena approached the pedestal, her heart racing. She knew this was it, the heart of the house, the source of its power. The truth was hidden here, and she was determined to find it. The Dark Pact. As Lena opened the book, the pages seemed to turn on their own, the ink shifting and rearranging in front of her eyes. The words blurred together, creating a dark narrative that seemed to pull her in. The House of Aether, she read aloud, her voice trembling. A place of lost souls, a prison for the damned. The house feeds on memories, rewriting the past and erasing the future. It is a living entity, cursed and hungry. The house does not just trap the body. It traps the soul, stealing its essence and locking away for eternity. Only those who have been chosen can escape, but they must leave behind their humanity. The price of freedom is more than life. It is the soul. Lena's stomach churned as she read the final words. The house wasn't just a prison for those who entered. It was a trap for their very essence, a parasite that consumed their memories and their identities. She turned the page, desperate to understand more. The next page was blank. Lena felt the room shift around her, the walls closing in as the air grew heavier. Something was happening. The house was reacting to her discovery, to the knowledge she was uncovering, the final choice. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut with a force that shook the entire room. Lena spun around, her heart in her throat. The once calm, still air was now alive with energy, as if the house itself had come to life. The whispers filled the room again, louder this time, their voices demanding her attention. "You are ours now, Lena. There is no escaping." Lena backed away from the book, her heart racing. The walls were shifting, closing in, and the very floor beneath her feet seemed to be disappearing into the abyss. The house was responding to her presence, to her knowledge of its twisted existence. She ran toward the door, but it was no use. The house had locked her in, trapping her in its dark heart. She felt the weight of the house pressing down on her chest, the dark energy suffocating her. Then, the figure appeared again, the shadow from the mirror. This time, its face was clear, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It stepped forward, its presence overwhelming. "It's too late, Lena. You've seen too much." The voice was familiar, but distorted, as if it came from the house itself. "You are part of the house now. Your soul will be absorbed into its history, its eternal hunger. There is no turning back." Lena's breath quickened, her vision blurring as the walls seemed to close in around her. The house was not just a place. It was a living thing, and it wanted her. It had always wanted her. But there was one thing the house didn't understand. Lena was not ready to give up. The awakening. Lena reached into her pocket, pulling out the key once more. It glowed brightly in her hand, the symbol on it pulsing with energy. She knew what she had to do. With a sharp breath, Lena raised the key above her head and drove it into the floor, the symbol glowing as it sank into stone. The ground shuddered, and a blinding light filled the room. The house screamed, its voice deafening, its fury palpable. But Lena held her ground. Her will stronger than the house's power. She was breaking the cycle, shattering the hold it had on her. The walls trembled, and the ground cracked open beneath her feet. The house, for the first time, was faltering. Episode 10, Endgame, The Heart of the House. The darkness of Aether House had taken on a physical form. It wasn't just an oppressive atmosphere now. It was a weight in the air, a pressure against Lena's chest that grew heavier with every passing second. The whispers that had once been an eerie background hum now filled her mind, deafening and insistent, each voice clamoring for her attention. Lena had been in this house for what felt like an eternity. Days, weeks, maybe even months had passed since she first stepped through its doors. But it was impossible to know. Time had no meaning here. The house itself seemed to warp and bend time, its walls shifting like a living thing, changing to suit its needs, to trap her in its endless cycle. The key she had discovered was burning hot in her hand, but she wasn't sure if it was the key itself or the house's own dark energy seeping into her. Every room she entered, every door she opened, seemed to grow more sinister. The house wasn't just haunting her, it was actively feeding off her, drawing her deeper into its core. But Lena wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. The Library of Lost Souls. Lena stepped into the familiar library again. The bookshelves stretched up to the ceiling, lined with thousands of ancient tomes, all with titles she couldn't read. The scent of old paper and dust filled the air, mixed with the faintest hint of decay, as though the house was slowly eroding from within. It was the same as it had always been, yet it felt different. The energy here was thicker, heavier, almost suffocating. The moment she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the library like a death knell. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat, but there was no escaping now. She had come here for one reason. The truth. Lena reached out for the nearest book, her fingers grazing the spine. It felt wrong. The book was warm, as if it had been recently touched by another hand. A whisper came from the shadows, like a voice calling her name. Lena, you've come so far, but this is where it ends. The voice was familiar, but twisted. She had heard it before, in the mirrors, in the darkness. It was the house speaking to her. The entity that had taken everything, warped everything. Lena clutched the book tighter, determined not to let it slip from her grasp. But as she opened it, the pages were blank. She flipped through them, desperately searching for answers. But the more she looked, the more she realized the book wasn't just empty. It was empty by design. The house had erased the truth, a forbidden memory. The house had never been about just trapping people. No, it was more than that. Aether House was a vessel, a collector of souls, of memories, of identities. And now, it was trying to claim hers. Suddenly, the pages of the book began to shift. New text appeared, scrawled in a language Lena couldn't read, yet somehow understood. The words were familiar. They were memories, fragments of her own past, moments she thought had been lost forever. The truth was hidden here, buried in her own mind. But the house didn't want Lena to remember. It wanted to keep her trapped in its web of lies. Lena closed her eyes, feeling the house's dark presence growing stronger. The walls seemed to close in, the air suffocating, and the whispers became louder, more urgent. She could feel her own memories slipping away, being erased as if they never existed. You could not escape, Lena. The voice was louder now, almost taunting her. You belong to me now. You always have. The shuddering sensation of the house's will tightening around her made Lena gasp for air. She couldn't let it have her. She had to break free, to destroy the source of its power. She had to find a way to rewrite her own story, to reclaim her memories before they vanished forever. The dark mirror. Lena's vision blurred as she stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the chair in front of her. But before she could regain her balance, she caught sight of something in the reflection. the mirror on the opposite wall. She hadn't noticed it before, but now it stood there, as though it had been waiting for her. The surface shimmered, like liquid, distorting the reflection. She saw her own face, but it wasn't the same as it had been before. There was something wrong in her eyes, something empty. The reflection flickered again, and this time, it wasn't Lena looking back. It was Thomas. Lena froze, her heart skipping a beat. Thomas, her only hope in this house, the one who had warned her, the one who had tried to protect her. But there he was, staring back at her from the mirror, his face pale, his eyes hollow. "Lena, it's too late for you." The voice from the mirror was his, but it was distorted, like the house itself was speaking through him. "I couldn't save myself. I can't save you either." Lena's breath caught in her throat. This was it. She was being consumed by the house, and she had no choice but to face the truth of what had happened to Thomas. He had become part of the house. Just as she was about to, the mirror began to crack, the glass splintering like a shattered soul, and Lena could feel the presence of the house pushing against her, forcing her to confront what she had been running from, the choice of freedom. As the cracks in the mirror deepened, Lena's mind raced. She didn't want to become another lost soul in this house. She didn't want to fade into the darkness forever. There had to be a way out, a way to destroy the house, to reclaim her identity. The key burned in her hand again, the energy from it crackling in the air. She understood now. The key wasn't just a tool. It was a vessel of the house's power. She could use it, turn it against the mansion itself. But there was a cost. In her moment of clarity, Lena realized that in order to destroy the house, she would have to give up something vital. Her memories, her sense of self, would be the price she paid. If she wanted to survive, she would have to become a new person, free from the house's influence, but at the cost of everything that had come before. She glanced at the shattered mirror, at the distorted version of herself staring back at her, and felt the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. "You can choose, Lena." The voice from the mirror echoed, louder now. "You can leave, but you will never be the same." Lena took a deep breath and stepped forward, gripping the key tightly. She had to decide. To leave this nightmare behind, to free herself from the house, she would have to break the cycle. The final act. Lena raised the key high above her head, and as she did, a brilliant light exploded from it, illuminating the entire room. The house screamed in fury, its walls shaking violently as if the very structure of the mansion was crumbling under the weight of her will. The floor beneath her feet cracked open, and the house's grip loosened for the first time since she had entered. With one final scream, Lena drove the key into the ground.